So once Health Canada has approved the drug, is this drug now available for all Canadians to use?
Yes and no. So it's approved for sale in Canada, which means any prescriber, physician, nurse practitioner can prescribe the drug. The Health Canada approval, as I mentioned, when it goes through the clinical trial process and approval process through Health Canada, is for specific indications. And so it gets approved for those specific indications, and that's what it's available for the prescribers to prescribe it in those indications. But that's available for sale and prescribing. That doesn't mean it's eligible for coverage. So there's then an access issue for patients around whether they can afford the drug or not. So even if they get a prescription, sometimes what we see in pharmacy is that people don't pick up their prescription because they can't afford it, and that gets into the whole coverage issues.
So let's talk about that a little bit. How then do people who need these drugs, how do they get them covered on their plans?
So there's different kinds of coverage. There's public coverage, which is through the provincial governments. And an important fact that sometimes people aren't aware of is the Canada Health Act covers physician services and hospital services, but actually prescription drugs were never included in the Canada Health Act. And so provincial drugs are covered provincially. And so that's why you will see differences across the country as far as the provincial programs in who they cover, what they cover, and to what extent of how they cover it from that perspective. So
it's actually the provinces then, and respective provinces and territories, that are making the decisions on whether or not a drug gets covered and put into the formulary?
Correct.
Right, okay.
That's correct. So that process has developed over several years, and there's various steps to that particular process. And how that works is that the provinces look at, so Health Canada looks at, from the safety and efficacy that I talked about, the provinces are really looking at, you'll hear these terms, value for money, cost effectiveness. And so what they're trying to understand is, for drugs that they already cover on the formulary, how does this new drug compare from a cost effectiveness perspective? So they're doing the comparisons. Something I forgot to mention from the Health Canada process is that usually when a drug comes to market, it's versus placebo or an inert substance that has no effect in your body. There are more and more, it's happening now, what we call head-to-head trials, where a drug is compared to a drug that also has activity in your body, but a lot of times drugs gets approved when it's just versus placebo. So that doesn't help the provincial governments when they're trying to decide whether to fund a drug or not, because they want to know how does it compare to drugs that they cover, and if the clinical trial evidence, you don't actually have that head-to-head comparison, it's difficult to do. So there's various scientific methods that they do. You'll hear terms like meta-analysis and those kinds of things, where they'll look at other clinical trials that have been done in comparator drugs and try to make those comparisons, but it's challenging because you have different trial designs and you have different patient populations. So what they've done is they've established expert bodies and processes. You may have heard of CADTH and the Common Drug Review. CADTH is the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health, and they house the Common Drug Review. They're the secretariat for that. And it's a group of experts that look at the clinical cost effectiveness perspective, as well as they do a pharmacoeconomic review as well. And so it's really trying to get at that value for money question.
I think one of the things that's interesting here too is that patients, caregivers, physicians can weigh in or have a voice in the drug review process. And I think it's on the federal and on the provincial level. Is that correct?
So it's being recognized over the last several years how valuable the patient input is into these review processes. They really need to understand the patient's perspective. What value or what challenges do patients experience, and what does that mean for them? So, for example, if a patient's exhausted all treatment options and this new drug actually provides value to them, that's a really important point for the experts when they're doing their reviews to really understand that perspective. So it's important for patients to educate themselves, either them individually or through an advocacy organization. And then the Common Drug Review actually has a patient voice way that you can give your perspective through those drug review processes, and it's all on their website.
And so we'll run that website, so if there is someone out there that would like to, lend their voice and be part of an upcoming drug review, then they can go to that website and find out how to get involved in that process.
Absolutely. So what the Common Drug Review does is they review the evidence, as I mentioned, from the cost effectiveness perspective, and then it goes to an expert committee who then makes a recommendation to the provinces. So Common Drug Review is established by the provinces and territories and the federal government, and it's a recommendation making body, because at the end of the day the provinces are the ones that have to determine can they afford to list the new drug or not on their formulary. So the recommendation from the Canadian expert group is to say yes, based on our review and the clinical evidence and pharmacoeconomic review, we think there's value, so yes, we think you should list it. They might say, yes, list it, but only if the cost is less expensive. The manufacturer should consider lowering the cost of the drug. Or they could say, no, we don't think the clinical cost effectiveness evidence is strong enough, and we recommend that the provinces not list the drug. Once that happens, then there's another body called the PanCanadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which was also set up through the territories, provinces, and federal government. Really, their goal is to enhance access by negotiating better prices with manufacturers. And in that way, it also ensures consistency across the country as far as the price that provinces and provincial and federal programs would pay for drugs that are on the formularies. And so that Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, again, is a recommending body that they go through a process, they do the recommendations, and then they provide a recommendation through what they call a letter of intent. The province, again, has the option to accept it or not. And it really comes down to a couple of things from the provincial perspective is, one, do they actually have the budget to fund the drug or not? Just like individuals, we all have limited funds, and you have to make those, value for money decisions. There's finite resources. So the province looks at that. They look at, are these drugs that we actually cover on formularies? Because there are certain categories of drugs that aren't covered. And then they look at, if we are going to cover it, are there special circumstances? If it's more expensive, perhaps we need to limit the population that gets access to that. And how they do that is looking at the clinical trial criteria.
We've been hearing in the media a lot about the National Pharmacare initiative, and you're talking about the provinces are the ones, obviously, that ultimately make the decision on will a drug be included in their formulary and the pricing around it. So with this National Pharmacare, is this something that could provide greater equity across the provinces and territories?
Yes, that's the whole idea behind National Pharmacare. There's been a lot of reviews done by various experts across the country looking at the inequities. And so when I talked earlier about the Canada Health Act and how drugs aren't covered and it's provincially covered, there are inequities on who is covered. So for example, in British Columbia, we cover everybody that has medical services coverage. They're eligible for Pharmacare. There's different plans and different structures, but ultimately everybody's covered. A lot of the other provinces only cover those on social assistance or seniors, and so most of the general population isn't covered. And so it's those inequities that it's trying to address. And so it's still not decided where National Pharmacare is going to land. There's a lot of different perspectives of what that should look like, but I think we're moving closer and closer, and we might see something in the next couple of years.
So Suzanne, this is so informative. Can you stay with us just a bit longer?
Oh, I'd love to.
Great, so don't go anywhere.